give the mic now to Akintunde Babatunde, who is one of the major voices in environmental generally, natural extractive industry matters, but quite recently a leading thought leader in climate change. In the 10 minutes I give you, please just try to lead the foundation.
Good afternoon, everyone, and it's good to be here. I like to say first that the reason why at the Center for Journalism, Innovation and Development, we decided to start what we call the Natural Resources and Extractives Program some 5 to 7 years ago was because we understood at the time that the way the media, and this is a little bit of background, a lot of time when people come up stage to talk about a particular sector and they talk about the role of journalists, it's always interesting to me what they say to be the role of journalists is for them to add journalists to a WhatsApp group where they would always forward press release to those journalists. So they would say, oh wait, you're a journalist and you report oil and gas? Oh, that's fine. I have a WhatsApp group for you where I will be pushing press release. Same with climate change. And at the center, we thought no. Because if you want journalists to report oil and gas, if you want journalists to report mining, if you want journalists to report forest resources, then you have to get to understand that a lot of the journalists in Nigeria and in West Africa, they are not subject matter experts. So most of them, have different disciplines. It's just a bit for them. And if you want them to report issues on oil and gas that is very technical, then you really need to bring them on board to come from a place of knowledge. If you have to report any subject, it has to come from a place of knowledge. So at CGID, we decided to build a program around helping to get journalists to become experts within the subject base. Research has shown that if you spend 10,000 hours on any topic, you literally have a decent understanding of such issues. So that was why we decided to launch the Natural Resources and Extractives Program at the time. Then when we get to organize, stakeholder engagement, bring journalists, bring media researchers, bring academic researchers together to have a thinking about these issues, we discovered most times that there is a connection. You get to see someone report about mining, and you get to see them say there is a link between mining and environmental hazard. There is a link between all of these issues. Then you now talk about, a climate change, which is really interesting because in the context of climate change in West Africa is from a place of disaster. It's from a place of vulnerabilities. It's not much more a problem of emission. And we decided to say, all right, let's come around and think about how these issues affect us. And if it affects us this way, then it's important for the media to understand. So I needed to give us that background about the reason why we create a lot of the programs around environment, extractive sector, and climate change at the center. Then back to the way we have done this work and why it's important for us to pay attention. It would be that before 2020 that we started the climate change program at the center, we noticed that when people report climate change in Nigeria, in West Africa, they come from a place of, oh, there is flooding, and so it's climate change. And we thought that if there is flooding, and it is much more about the fact that it is more than flooding. And if it is more than flooding, you have to interrogate how this plays out. Because what the government would do when we have issues of flooding in Nigeria would be to create a committee to think about flooding. And a year or two after, we are still thinking about the committee. But if you want to bring the issues to the forefront, then it has to be from a place of, you know what? Even though we have issues of flooding, it was caused because of excessive rainfall, and that was because of the change in weather pattern and climate change issues. Then you also have to remember that there are some communities, the coastal communities that got eroded with flooding, that they don't have business being eroded if shore protection projects were adequately constructed. So we started to think about how these things have happened, and we started investing in getting journalists to travel around for documentaries to understand how, for instance, a very popular, the poster child of sea surge or sea level rise in Nigeria would be Ayantola in Ondo State. But the problem of Ayantola really would be because in the early 2000, there was a shore embankment project, a shore protection project by the NDDC that billions were awarded for that project. A contract was awarded for that project, but after a few months, it was re-awarded to another contractor, and up till now, in 2023, that project is still there. And so, at every point where you have heavy rainfall, and the community would definitely get eroded. And so, it's much more of the fact that, yes, we have heavy rainfall issues, and we also have a problem of accountability within that frame. But if you don't understand that you can just come around and say climate change, yes. But if funds meant for the ecological funded projects that government get billions every year for, if we get to do those, then it makes sense for you to know that people have to pay attention to those issues beyond the surface level. And if journalists have to report those issues, then it has to come from a place of knowledge. Because if you are not knowledgeable about the fact that we have something called ecological funded projects that get statutory allocation, they don't even look at that, then you cannot interrogate the reason why people of Ayantola community would save a last-minute intervention, they will go extinct. And that is why in Abari, in Delta State, they would always have that problem. And that is why, so that's the way we think about it. That from the place of the environmental consequences of those issues. And also when we look at that, you know that, and I want to give you a little context about the concept of climate change and how it makes sense, so it makes sense for people. We've been here since yesterday, since the day before yesterday. Imagine that since the day before yesterday, you haven't had anything to eat. You are not on marathon, you are not fasting, but you haven't had anything to eat, no tea break, no lunch, nothing. Your body system will start to react. And what happens is that the capacity to adjust well becomes a problem. And what happens to you would be, but now bringing it to climate change, over the years, because of the way humans live, because of the way we think about the work that we do, because of energy and all of those things, we continue to make a mess of the earth. And that has made it unable to be able to retain the energy it needs to service us well. And the question then is that because you haven't had food in the last 3 days, and your body now feels like you are not feeling so well, then you need to, one, get to eat something, then get medicine, right? And that is why we say that the problem of climate change then makes sense, because even though where we are at the moment, the body of the earth is shrinking and it's making a lot of problems that are there, but the solution is that you have to feed into it what it makes sense for the earth to survive. And that is where we say we have to control the way we live our life. Now we have to think of the fact that our energy source, the way we power our vehicles and all of those things. But because we are a country or we are a continent where we are poor financially, so we are not able to build resilient systems that help us to get shock against these issues. And if you want to come from a prism of climate change and talk about it, and then it has to be from a place of that, understanding. And that was why we decided to create the climate change reporting desk for newsrooms, so they can report these issues from that place of understanding. Now back to what we should be thinking as media organizations, journalists, and policymakers. It has to be the fact that, you know what, if we don't pay attention and declare an honest state of emergency on the climate crisis, and think of how we can create local solutions, because what we have seen with COVID has shown that when the disaster comes, then it becomes the responsibility of the people who are vulnerable. No country would be ready to say, no, look at when the COVID vaccine came. The countries that are rich and are able to afford this had to take care of themselves first. What African countries had to do would be to say, you know what, we have to look for grants, we have to look for aid and all of those things. So what that means right now is that, and for us to know that this is a big problem, then the media that helps to bring these issues to spotlight have to be informed and come from a place of setting agenda. And if you can't set agenda, then you have to say that, you know what, the government of today in Nigeria, you don't have cabinet portfolio leaders at the moment. Oh, okay, that's fine. All right, thank you very much.
So, Caroline, you've done all this work across, West Africa. You've carried the messages to newsrooms, trying to build fact-checking desks here and there. But we know that fact-checking, can just do so much. What we're dealing with now are very serious issues of disinformation, which the mainstream fact-checking program cannot respond to, and it's going to get worse. That's what I hear from your community. So run us through why we should care about verification as a program, and what do we need to do?
Okay, thank you, sir, for your question, and good afternoon, everyone. You already laid the foundation, the reason why we are even in the fact-checking and verification business. And yesterday, our guest speaker, keynote speaker, Richard Gevers, also mentioned the reason why we're here and we're even talking about fact-checking, verification. Like we all know, it is not a new challenge. The reason why we are actually in this room, I think, and I believe on this panel speaking about it, is technology. It's become a bigger problem, and we are aware of the dangers that it's causing. Akintunde mentioned COVID-19 and the lessons that we all got to learn from it. We saw that, fact checkers also saw that during the pandemic. For us at Dubawa and the Center for Journalism Innovation, I think that we realized at the very beginning that fact checking wasn't going to be enough to address the challenge of misinformation. And I must say that fact-checking has grown tremendously in the last decade or so. If you consider 2008, I think we had just about 11 fact-checking desks globally, but today we have over 417. And in Africa alone, we currently have 54 active fact-checking organizations, whereas I think just in 2013, there was just Africa Check. So we have come to the realization that we need to address information disorder. But then all of us have been focused on fact-checking. And our focus on fact-checking, as someone who has been doing fact-checking for over 4 years, I don't think there's still a lot more to be done, right? And so, like I said, at Dubawa and CJID, we recognized that we needed to do a lot more. So what we've been doing over the last 5 years to address the challenge, verification and fact-checking, there is that. And then we also know that people are the ones who spread false information. Some of them deliberately, some not so. So at the core of our work also has been media and information literacy. We know that if you know that if this text or WhatsApp message I'm receiving is misinformation and you're a good citizen, you will not spread it, right? So we've been doing that also a lot over the last 5 years. And we also are aware that for us to have the reach that we need, we need to move offline. A lot of the work of fact checkers over the years has been online, mainly on social media, because we say that social media is the hub of false information. It is the hub of false information, but then also false information trickles down from the user on social media. So how are we ensuring that we reach those who are offline? And so in all of our endeavors, all of our work at CJID and Dubawa, what we do is we partner with traditional media as well. So we've been working with radio, community radio especially, because they have direct contact with the people. Also to spread our fact checks and for media and information literacy. Another challenge that we identified in the early days of Dubawa is the death of research, around misinformation and disinformation on fact checking in Africa, right? I think that if you are a student or you've ever had to do your research in Africa, from Ghana or wherever, and you're looking for resources, journal articles, for your literature review, you find that very few of them are about Africa written by the Africans, right? And that's what we found around fact-checking and information disorder in Africa. And so at the center, we've also been doing some research around misinformation and disinformation. The last but not the least is the need for us to work with the technology companies, right? Because we believe, well, it is true that they also have a role to play in the spread of false information. So it must be a joint effort, a collaborative effort at tackling the problem. So we've been working with technology companies, and we've also been, in response to, so probably I'll talk about that when we are talking about some of the things that need to be done. Yeah. But then it's important that we work with them. But again, like Richard said, we have, I tend to believe that there's been an over-reliance on the tech companies, and we need to address that also. Maybe I get to talk about that later, or do I do that now?
Okay, so we'll come back to all that later then. Yeah, thank you very much, yes. So Ayantola, you really do some work right out from both in the UK, in Nigeria, around from data to technology and how this can affect the fortune of the media. It's important, with all our colleagues here to walk us through, what those processes are out there, who is doing what, and why is this important at this time?
Yeah, thank you for that. Hi, everyone. So just two caveats before I move ahead. The first one is I'm not a journalist. So I'm a bit of a policy guy here. And obviously the second one is I feel like I'm in a tricky place right now. Obviously when you get to speak last in the very final panel, you don't have a lot to say because everyone has said what you have to say. But yeah, just kidding. So basically, so the work that I do is a bit in between being a technologist and also being a researcher. So I like to describe myself as a computational social scientist, so doing a bit of work around how do you use the insights from data to inform policy, and obviously much of that within the development space. So thinking about the media itself in a very particular sense, there are three things that come to mind for me in terms of where we are right now with technology, and especially with artificial intelligence. A lot of people have said a lot about AI. It's been a very interesting conversation right now. But I will just pick up from what Caroline and Akintunde have said from the reporting point of view, right? I think there's a big challenge right now in terms of how the media reports on technology. And this is not something very peculiar to Nigeria anyways. It's something that we're seeing much globally. There's an AI panic. Every time I go to my Google tab, the next news I want to read on AI is about ChatGPT or some other foundational model. But there's been a lot more going on in terms of technology beyond, these foundational models or chatbots. And I think it was Joshua was making reference to the fact that journalism itself is an outpost of technology, and at least the rate at which we have it in Nigeria today, digital journalism at least, is an outpost of technology. So how do we begin to think about this entire space beyond the fad, beyond the usual? Everybody talks about artificial intelligence from ChatGPT. Do we have a sort of training for journalists on how they report on technology, right? There's a lot of nuance around the entire technology conversation. How do we get journalists to understand this, first of all? But also, how do we build a community of practice around it, right? I do some work at the Bennett Institute for Public Policy at the University of Cambridge. And what we often find, which is, this is a very unfair comparison, right? To compare countries. But what I'm seeing, at least from my work so far, in terms of, public technology, is that you kind of find every hands coming on deck, right? You find researchers being able to work easily with politicians, being able to work easily with the media. You find representative of some of these other organizations. But what we find in the Global South, there's a stratification, right? And that's not uncalled for, simply because the technology is very much new. So how do we ensure that the media is that rallying point, to create a community of practice, right? Such that we could help government as well to think as stakeholders in terms of policy, a lot of things to talk about, but I don't want to bore you. You've heard a lot about artificial intelligence already. Now, I think the second point is seeing the media itself as an innovator. I think Richard was talking about over-reliance on big tech so far, and I think one challenge that we've seen, Joshua and I, we're doing some work on an artificial intelligence product called Nubia. One challenge that we've seen is the inability of global south tech companies to have their own proprietary platforms. Simply because this is expensive, first of all, and also challenges with data access, data labeling, representativeness of the data. So how do we help media platforms like CGID, for instance, to build this kind of proprietary technologies, especially with regards to artificial intelligence? And of course, also, how do we overcome some of the innovation challenges? Of course, as a journalist, you're not expected to be necessarily be, a data guy or necessarily know how to do things in Python or R. But it's also very important to have, I heard someone saying today that, he runs a media house that has 2 full-time data analysts. And for him, it's something very rare, right, in Nigeria to have. But I don't think it should be rare, right? How do we enable other media houses to have this kind of full-on capacity? Obviously, it's not about running to technology at every beck and call. Technology is not always the solution. But where it's needed, how easy is it for media houses to be able to access ML engineers, for instance, have data science guys on their board? So I think, these 2 things, first of all. And the third thing is having a healthy consumption of technology itself, right? So it's not enough to just say, oh, you're a journalist. Do you know how to use ChatGPT? Can you use some of these other generative media platforms, right? How do you ensure such consumption is ethical, right? So there's something going on now with regards to the AI conversation, which is, for every media house that uses AI, right, we should have some sort of regulation, some sort of provenance mechanisms for you to be able to say, this is how I found this content online, and you can verify it, or you can go through the same trace. So those are the things I'm thinking about from a broader point of view, but obviously we can go into more details.
Okay, so we'll come back to set the agenda as it were. Thank you very much, guys. So last but not the least, Moturayo Alaka. You currently run the Say Media program, which I believe is enabled also by Mercator, through which you're trying to reach subnational level. Tell us why this is very important as the next front of work if we really want to make our democracy meaningful and, in fact, create the basis for development in this country. Why must we work with state, local council media? And how will we do that?
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. So I would try to talk about all the issues, try to put them together: development, democracy, journalism. I've said in the last few years, as we look at the future, that the future for journalism is local, the future for journalism is collaborative, the future for journalism is digital. So I'll try to unpack these, and then I'll talk a bit about how this is what the future is, how we should be addressing this future. So when we talk about local, every news is first and foremost local. So when you're dealing with a COVID-19 or you're dealing with an Ebola, you're thinking first of Wuhan. You have to trace it back. You're thinking of Ebola, you're thinking of the Ebola River in DRC. You have to trace it back to local. It is at local level that you get nuance. It is at the local level that you get context. It is at that local level that you're able to learn. And local, from my perspective and learning in this work, is that we must not define it just as geography, we must also define local as community, community of geography, community of interest, which is something I expound in the Rush model, report until something happens. So we're learning that in Nigeria, the media is saturated at that national level. And at that national level, we are pretty much regurgitating the same thing, which is why our economics will be bad, because what we are reporting has been reported online first, and then we are regurgitating it the next morning. No, we're not bringing extra context, extra nuance. We're not bringing extra information. We're not doing the journalistic work. We're, just, so if we want to do that work that makes us distinct and make us relevant, then we have to think local. We have to think local because, like I said, local is where you get evidence. You see the evidence, because data is not abstract. When you talk about data, you're talking about people's lives. You're talking about service to people. You're talking about money. It is not abstract. It is concrete. And it is at local level that you get that. Also, the relevance of community and the need for diversity of voices. I do a lot of media monitoring, and we do a lot of media monitoring at the Wole Soyinka Center for Investigative Journalism. And what we find is that we quote our government officials too much. We just say, oh, the president said, the governor said, that's, the people are saying things that they need to hear. So if you want diversity of voices, if you want the voices of women, the voices of persons with disability, the voices of young people, the voices of the different, more than 250 languages that we have in this country, then you have to think local, because that is where that diversity comes. That is where we begin to think of how we deliver what we produce in different languages. And when we're thinking technology, we are thinking technology at those people's level. So people are now using hybrid cars, but bicycles are not yet out of vogue. So we have to think of technology in that sense. For some people, WhatsApp is technology. We have to be able to acknowledge that and reach them at that local level of what is technology to them and how it translates to the work that you're doing. We also need to think of professional journalism at that level. If you look at the landscape of media in Nigeria, you'll find that, yes, many of them are focused on national. When you get to local and state level, you'll find that the public, what should be public service media, is the media of the government in power. And if you think it's bad at the federal level, then go to the state level. There are actually almost personal assistants and, voices of the governor, of the commissioners, of the people at that level. You find that independent media is missing at that level. So for those of us who are big, Daily Trust, Premium Times, we need to start thinking of Premium Times Ogun, because we need to focus on what is happening in that state and at that local level so that we can hold our government accountable. We have a federalism. If we're talking of federalism, we're saying that the units are autonomous. So there's a lot of power at the state level. And state governors are getting away with murder, literally. So at that level, we need to reach the people. We're talking about public service that we do not report well in Nigeria. How do people get water? How do they get school? Are the teachers good? How are their roads? What is the condition of the health centers? These are where the stories are. I'm often amazed when journalists say no story. There's too much story right at the local level in your community. So we have to be thinking about that. If governance is local, if development is local, journalism that has to make a difference has to go local.
Thank you, Motunrayo. I will come back to laying the agenda very clearly. I think what's clear to us is that when we're talking of journalism, we all know that in a democracy, we have three principal goals and responsibilities to fulfill. So we know that we have to provide accountability mechanisms using journalism as the tool. We know that we really have to set agenda. And of course, we have to do gatekeeping work. If we're doing journalism, you can't escape from these three calls. So what I'm going to do now is to then ask these, my very august speakers to address this issue. Let's move in terms of what we've been talking about. Richard and Ayantola, you're talking about technology. Move it to journalism for us in the sense of agenda. Caroline, verification, media literacy. Let's see this in agenda. Akintunde, climate. And Motunrayo, subnational journalism. Let's see what this means in concrete terms. Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay, so the agenda for tech in journalism. Big question. So a lot of it's been covered already. I think my main thing is to remember people first. So tech is all about anyone who's in the sort of tech or digital space that has been successful in the design of good platforms will understand that knowing your customer or your user is everything. And so what I love about what's being said about, like, for example, focus on climate or focus on subnational journalism is that we need to embrace how we build tech into our the pipeline of production of news, all right? So that is everything from how are we building in data platforms within the news environment, data platforms that can ingest a lot of data help you analyze trends of what's going on, help you report on critical topics, help you visualize and analyze and produce really good content that's based on what your people are needing to read. I think an agenda for tech is immersive storytelling. And so there's a lot that's happening. There's a lot of buzzwords around this agenda tech, and that's why I want to take it to people. But again, you can create a lot with different types of content creation, AR and VR, that can help people understand the context of a situation. I think the agenda for tech and journalism is also very much about understanding the legal and ethical implications of what's going on. So really understanding that, for example, what Daniel Matang and others have done in unionizing content moderators, and the fact that AI and the discussion around AI is being presented as a global catastrophe, and they're sort of trying to take everyone's focus onto like an arms race, where the true discussion around AI right now is where there's exploitation and misrepresentation right now, and there's a lot that we as journalists need to be focused on, both in, as we've heard earlier, like embracing AI and understanding where it's useful, but also understanding how it's being created, where there's distortions coming out of it, and how we, as especially West African journalists, can speak to what's happening in that space, right? So I think there's a massive agenda in stopping othering technology. So that's a lot of, for Africa Data Hub, I mean, in the work we do and others in the room, when we come in with digital data or technology interventions in newsrooms, it's very often like something that's othered. But as we've heard, like from WhatsApp, which is a technology, to AI, to data platforms, this stuff needs to be the native conversation within a newsroom, from the executive to the people producing content. Now, what we're very lucky at in this continent is that there is a lot of unemployment in youth, but there's a lot of youth that are either like data scientists and data natives, as well as technology and content natives. And so to me, it's nuts that we've sort of battling to find skills when we've got a lot of people coming through with the skills that we can utilize. And really what I think it is that we don't have a tech agenda inside our newsroom. And so when we start to even look to hire people and bring skills in, like there's a huge amount of development needs to happen. With big platforms, like there's going to continue to be a power imbalance with big platforms. We must embrace big platforms, but we must understand we need to have our own tech strategy, data strategy, and know that the platforms work for us, not the other way around. And once again, it's all around, tech agenda is all around understanding how to get to people, connect to them, and also like how we can make mainstream things that we know, if we're working about democracy, to take the tech agenda back to democracy, that is climate, gender, health, education. How do we get to produce this content? Again, I love like national. I love connecting to people in different languages. I love different types of immersive storytelling. I like embracing data to both tell the story but also produce something that's relevant. I like AI for helping us curate and fact check and all these sorts of things. So like this panel is really kind of great for presenting what a tech agenda is, because again, the tech agenda needs to be very solid, but not tail wagging the dog. It needs to be about what we care about, and it needs to serve that.
Okay. So, yeah. So, folks, just take a relay in 5 minutes each, so that we give the audience some opportunity for questions.
Yeah, just to follow up where Richard stopped. Well, it's kind of hard to itemize specific actions in terms of next steps. But just to be straightforward, I'd say the tech agenda is a winner-take-all effect. So there's a money agenda here, actually. We should really be talking funny. And I mean this because, so when we think about artificial intelligence use cases, for instance, on the African continent, there seems to be a heavy focus on things like fintech. Fintech companies using AI, and a lot more around education as well, recently on agriculture and a couple of other social sectors. Nobody really gives much attention to AI use in journalism. And the facts are clear, because like the return on investment immediately is not very financial, right? So it's more social. So I think we should begin to think about how do we then help this sector to bootstrap, right? So there's a financial challenge here. And secondly, related to that is that, because tech is very contextual, right? So again, this might be a bit of self-referencing. Joshua and I have a piece out with Research in ICT Africa, which looks at how can you use generative artificial intelligence in African newsrooms. And much of that touches on the three critical anchors of journalism. So news production, news distribution, and revenue. And what we actually find is that there is almost no newsroom in Africa today that's a bit authoritative, that's using generative AI in this sense. Like a couple of organizations are coming up using other forms of technologies, recommendation algorithms and all of that. So how do we enable media houses to be able to do this more specifically? So I think funding is needed for that. Second thing is training. I think Richard talked about that. I wouldn't have to stretch on that a lot more. But of course, training in terms of using the technology, but also in terms of reporting on it and understanding the ethics and legal dimension to it. I think there's a need for cross-sectoral partnership. I mentioned that already. How should the media be thinking about working with government, but also working with international partners, right? So this is very important because as much as tech is contextual, it's also borderless, right? So your data could be used in Nigeria as much as it could be used in Chicago, you know, all of those things that we know about data. And my final point, which is a bit more specific to CGID now, I understand that the CGID is a bit positioned to cover West Africa region. And in my sense, I can't really think of any organization that's doing some sort of tech policy thinking in the West Africa region. Again, there's much reference to RIA. I do a lot of work with them. But this is also heavily focused on Southern Africa, right? So today, if you're thinking about the AI policy landscape, for instance, you find many more policy documents coming out of Southern Africa than you find from West Africa. Of course, the South Africa effect is there. So how do we control for the Nigeria effect as well? We want sort of a think tank or a community of practice thinking around data technology and development in West Africa. CGID is probably doing that, but maybe a bit more push into that frontier.
Right. I think when it comes to climate change media, pretty much at CGID we actually have clear models on how we have been able to help do this. So we have so what we noticed that most media organizations only report climate change during flooding season. We thought to say, because climate change, flooding is an environmental problem. So if you want to talk climate change, then you don't see it as an abstract conversation. It is in health, it is in mining, it is everywhere. In fact, when you talk of insecurity in Nigeria, then you can always have that conversation around, competition for scarce resources when it comes to farmer-header clashes. You look at all of those things, they are all environmental issues, climate change issues, and all of those things. So what we did was to start what we call the Climate Change Media Fellowship, where in West Africa, where we have journalists come around and for a 1 week boot camp to understand these issues. And these times we bring people who are actually experts on climate change. When we bring them on board, then it makes sense for them to understand how this flies. So after that, we then put them on a fellowship for about 3 to 6 months, depending on how we are able to finance that level of work. And we have seen that the major newsrooms in Nigeria today reporting climate change, you can go check it out. Most of the top journalists doing that were products of that fellowship program. And I think that's making sense. Then another model that we started last year is now to say, you know what, after the fellowship, let's try and build, help newsrooms to set up climate change reporting desk. So we recently set up, helped newsrooms to build 10 newsrooms, 5 in Nigeria, 5 in Ghana, to develop climate change reporting desk. But one interesting pattern when it comes to helping newsrooms with these processes would be that in the past, when you have reporting fellowship for journalists have clear understanding that they will pitch story ideas, they get funded for the story, and most times the fund they get through this process then make some of the editors, that was what we got as feedback, that some editors now say, why would you go get this grant and I have to edit it within the newsroom and I'm not getting a dime from it? Then it was a challenge. Then that was why we decided to help to now make it a newsroom kind of engagement, to say, can we work with newsrooms to do this process? Then the third way that we have looked at it would be the conference of parties. I don't know, after, most times in November, depending on when it is, everybody knows about COP. It is always a big conversation. But when you get to COP, conference of parties, that is the Global Climate Change Conference, you always see everybody reporting COP, but they report COP from a place of what global people are talking about, not what is happening there. And anyone who has been to COP would know that COP always be between 12 to 14 days. You can be there and be working to find your way for the 14 days. You won't be able to do anything. And so last year, we decided to develop a COP27 reporting handbook. And after that, we then created a platform to say, even if you are not going to COP, we created this platform. Those who are there would drop on conversations there so that you can pick it and then escalate and then bring it out. But we also have that model at CGID. And the learning from that, and I think that will be the lesson moving forward, would be that newsrooms should, because the feedback we have gotten from some newsrooms will be that, you know what, climate change is a boring conversation. And it's not always attracting readership. And I tell some of them that, but why do you then report flooding? Because when it flooded last year in Lokoja, fuel tankers cannot move from that side of the way to Abuja, and it created fuel scarcity. But no, if you are not able to link that, and again, data now shows that the flooding that would happen this year would be more than the one from last year. What happened to the committee that the past government set up? Are we interrogating it? How much have we spent on ecological funded projects? How much are we investing? When Germany got flooded some years ago, they spent about 400 million euros for relief, and then they spent billions in euros to rebuild states. How much families have we rebuilt from the last flooding last year? How much from the flooding of 2012? But if people forgot, the families never forgot. And I think those are the questions the media should start asking, and those are the agenda point that we have to bring to the forefront. And if the media is sleeping on climate change conversation, then I think that flooding will remind us that we are all in it together. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Okay, Caroline, run us very quickly, so that we can then do questions.
I'll try to be quick. So moving it into journalism, I think that it's important for all journalists to be aware of the role that they play. You know, we are supposed to be the ones to provide accurate information. Unfortunately, a lot of the time, we end up being the ones misinformed, right? And we understand that this is as a result of multiple challenges, sometimes a sustainability crisis, which has led to a lot of newsrooms not having even fact-checking desks, you know, the need to break the news quickly, so we are not doing that. And then also as journalists, we forget the fact that we can become targets of misinformation and then amplifiers of misinformation, right? These days, we are in a hurry to go to Twitter, social media, look for the breaking news, and then break it. But then we know that we would end up misinforming others. So what can we do going forward? I've mentioned some of the things that we do at Dubawa, and in fact, it's not just Dubawa. A lot of fact-checking organizations have similar approaches to addressing the problem of information disorder. But then, along all of the value chain of all the solutions, you realize there needs to be more needs to be done. For instance, when we are talking about fact-checking, verification, along the value chain of claim identification, you know, how can you even source false information? Where are you seeing it from? The tools that have been built by tech companies, but then most of them, you see that they're social media focused. We know that in Africa, even though internet penetration has increased for Nigeria, I think it's about 55% of people who have access to the internet in Ghana. I must say proudly that we have 68 Ghanaians, 68% of Ghanaians who have access to the internet. So we beat you again at that.
Thank you very much.
But then we know there's the issue that there are people offline who are reliant on radio and TV. So we need to pay attention to how do we sort for claims on these legacy media, right? Because a lot of people still use them, and there's a lot of misinformation on those channels, so we need to do better there, right? And then when we come to the research tools, what are the available tools for verifying your information? There's the Google, Yandex, reverse image searches for images, but then they're not perfect. Fact checkers spend a lot of time, just verifying a single image, and sometimes you can't even find it online. So again, we need to think about the tools that can help make our work easier. And when we come to the distribution, right, and even our style, the format of our fact checks. Yesterday, I was intrigued when Professor Gajepo in one of the sessions said that, so they conducted a research, and then they found that some audiences do not actually they prefer the storytelling approach. I'm not narrating this well, right? But then fact-checking oftentimes is hard news, hardcore, and a lot of people may not like it. So fact-checkers need to rethink their format. How are you going to communicate your fact checks to people?
Okay. And Caroline, I'm sorry, we're running really desperately.
Okay, let me round up in just a minute, right? I'm not enjoying this.
Okay, yeah, but
okay, and then the last but not the least, again, should be the distribution channel. How are we getting our information across? And finally, again, last but not the least, media and information literacy. I believe that's one of the, it is a very important tool for addressing misinformation, but we do it on an ad hoc basis. I believe we need to start working with government to ensure that media and information literacy is incorporated in curricula from the very beginning, from school, the earliest age as possible, because we are aware that a lot of our youth, our children are being lured via social media into criminal activities, and we really need to do a lot more when it comes to media information literacy and working with government to ensure that we address information disorder.
Thank you.
I'm sorry you didn't get everything.
Motrayo, unfortunately, I have only 2 minutes for you, so we all cheated you out of time. So.
Is there a chairperson apart from you that I can ask for protection from? Okay, so quickly, I think that when we hear about we hear drug syndicate, we hear trafficking network, and recently in Nigeria, cabal has become a language where it tells us that, the people who are working against the progress of democracy, journalism, and development, they are collaborating. They are collaborating, they're in networks. So one of the things one of the how is that we need to collaborate, and we need to do it more intentionally. We need to understand that there are limitations to our knowledge, to our exposures, to the things we know. Like, for instance, sometimes I talk the way I do because I've learned from Daily Trust, I've learned from MAR, I've learned from CJID. So it's just a lot of knowledge from different people that you're gathering to do the work. So that is what we need to be doing. We need to be engaging, and we need to be engaging very intentionally. Also, we need to be thinking of intentional disruptions, and let me explain with 2 quick examples. Intentional disruption, so when we looked at our award system, we found that men were winning. We have an investigative award, men win, mostly. And so now, in 2017, we introduced an award program into our fellowship for the women. So there's an award for them, and then that gave a pedestal. And now in major newsrooms, we have people from this fellowship, head investigative journalism desk. They were not recognized before. So we need to think of things that disrupt the system. How do we enable, if you say that all the men are editors-in-chief, how do you put fronts or publishers? How do you put fronts into women who can run media organizations' hands so that they become publishers? So when you call publishers meeting, we're going to show up because we are publishers. That is the kind of intentional disruption that we're looking at. And Akintunde talked about climate change and what it is doing in newsroom. We need, as media people, to be honest, not purist. We need to be honest, not purist. Sometimes we approach it from a purist sense of view, and so we don't think about our own challenges and the problems that we have and the things that are not going right in media. We don't talk about our problems enough. So we need to approach this thing with some humility, knowing that we are also fallible people. We have challenges of ethics, challenges of resource governance. All of those things are in the media too. So we need to be more honest. We need to invest in knowledge. a lot of investment in knowledge. And one of the things that I see under the Rush model is that we're approaching our sources as sources. And so we're using them to complete stories. What happens when we begin to approach them as resource persons? People who teach us and help us understand the value chain of the topics and the themes that we are thinking about. You are only as good as your sources, they will say in journalism schools. So why don't we acknowledge them, actually sit them down to learn? In media monitoring, we find that interviews are fewer. But if the media wants to learn, the media needs to do more interviews that are not provoked by crisis. Because if you call me when there is crisis, then I am doing crisis management, even in my communication. But if you come to me when there's no crisis, I can tell you how the system works. And you can report in a nuanced way when you are reporting.
Okay,
also,
lastly.
Okay, two last things. We need to learn the business of journalism. We say we're editors, that's all we know. Sustainability is a big issue. If we need to be sustainable, we need to think about how do the numbers add up. Intervention organization donors have helped us a lot. We need to use that help to think about business models. And finally, for Africa and for Nigeria, I think the onus is on us as we report to build hope in society. If all of the work we do, if Africa is not going to change, if Nigeria is not going to change, then let's close up our organizations and go home. If you're doing it for nothing, then let's go home. So we're doing it because we know the country can change. We know that our work can actually amount to something. So as we report, let us think about how do we lift up the morale of Africa? How do we lift up the morale of Nigerians? How do we report in such a way that civic engagement starts and people ask questions? Because, you know, there is something called the economics of governance. Supply for good governance will rise as the demand for good governance rises. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much, and we don't have the time. I just crave your kind indulgence to at least call 111 questioners, and I'll just take it in that serial. And you guys will just help me to make your answers in just 1 minute each. So, no, shouldn't do that. Someone is raising. Okay, so let's take you. Who is here?
Okay. Good evening, everybody.
Gentleman White.
And then thank you very much for this opportunity. I want to thank the organizers of this program and CGID for your intervention. First of all, my name is Iweze Rose. I work in the area of environment and health. And then the concept of CGID is even what brought me here. I'm a professional and as well as a CSO. And so by that, I have a good knowledge in health and environment. So what you said regarding reporting, you know, what journalists do in reporting without in-depth knowledge is really true. And so what the challenge there is that how do we begin to, you know, bridge the gap between, you know, using all these challenges to change the society through policy, you know, getting the government to engage.
Okay, thank you so much. That's fine, that's fine.
I still have a couple more, sir.
No, we cannot take it. So sorry. Yeah, we just have to listen. Sir, ask your question. Yeah. Okay, and you guys just wait and take everything together. Yeah.
Good day. So my question.
No, not you. No, we throw it your zone. Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
Okay. To make it brief, my name is Abdulkarim Majid. I'm a journalist with Premium Times. So, talking about the issue of technology and all, I know just yesterday myself and a colleague here were discussing about how do we measure the issue of emission when you talk about climate change and the likes. So I just want to throw it open. Do we have any form of technology that measures emission, greenhouse gas emission, you know, accurately rather than assumptions and maybe estimations? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, this is the best group. I love that group. No questions from that group. So I'll just call you guys. I think we have to close because we really have to close. I guess leaving, and then we have to do closing back. So give me 1 minute each.
Right. So I think that it's not all I don't think that I didn't really make a clear, a final statement that most journalists don't have deep understanding. I was speaking about fantastic folks who do quality work. I mean, we have those. I wanted to acknowledge that. So, but I think the point really is the fact that if you want to report a beat, like you're reporting climate change, then you have to be intentional about understanding the climate change, like from a place of, I want to understand it. And if you go from that lens, and like she mentioned earlier, identify, at CGID, when we have workshop sessions, we say, now it has to be 50 people on your beat. Identify those people, 50 people, and then their contact and all of those. 50 places that relate to your beat. 50 events relating to your beat. But now I tell people 50 influencers.
Yeah,
to amplify. There are influencers that are known for health issues. If you have a story on health, then you get it. So I'm saying that, so if you have to identify 50 people, places, and events and influencers, and you attack your story and your work from that lens, then it makes sense because you are coming from a place of knowledge. And that is why when issues are happening, you can easily, write articles on explainers, analysis for people to understand. Thank you.
Thank you. Richard, do you have any technology that measures emission?
I could go on the GHG one. I could talk about research, not much about the technology. There's a lot of work out there. So whilst you were talking, I was just looking at the colleague at Cambridge who does some work around using digital data to measure climate change. So not necessarily greenhouse gas emissions. So there's several forms of climate change, right? So again, not to go into economics, you have the bad outputs and the bad input and all of that. So there's a lot of work going on that. I could send some of the papers to you in Nature. But it's not just social science. A lot of scientists are doing this as well. So one approach that I know that's common has been an historical look at average global warming per year, right? And you probably have seen this graph, online a lot. So which looks at global warming in the last, I think it's been in the last 200 years, right? So yeah, there's a lot of work on that. So tech, I can't speak to that, but I can speak to research. A lot of papers, a lot of.
Okay, we have last second.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the tech, there are a lot of technologies so mobile labs, I think flux towers. I'm not a scientist. But there's a lot of different measurements. But I think to the question that's interesting, so something initiatives like Africa Data Hub does is we can connect you to you need to connect to communities, and this was talked about with communities of practice, like science communities of practice, and understand how to extract the data and have it build the literacy around what the data are saying, and then how to build the output from that. So I mean, I think in terms of your need, I imagine we can chat afterwards. What would be good is to understand where and who is measuring greenhouse gas emissions in Nigeria, how to connect to data flows from that, how to set up the environment within your newsroom to use that data, and how to report on it to the way people need to use it. Yeah.
I'm so sorry to cut you guys off, but thank you so very much for a very enlightening period. And thank you so much for being good guests.
Thank you very much. Quick.